Before, I kind of felt like, okay, these things are nice for writing small bits of code here and there, but not for sort of planning out a full app. I now think they're good enough to plan out a full app. Just as we're creating apps with these models now, we're also basically teaching these companies how to make these models better to be able to get better at making these apps.
Good morning, Sam. How are you?
I'm good, Matt. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good. I am spending a lot of time rolling up my sleeves and working through some of these coding agents that have hit the market. This seems like a shakeup moment because a lot of these tools are allowing folks like me to jump in and actually start trying them out, right? So you had Claude Code released about 10 days ago, right? Anthropic released 3.7. You have Cursor releasing its agent. This feels like a shakeup moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think like in the past couple of weeks, we've talked about, different kinds of agents, especially in related to perhaps sort of the consumer side of things where, OpenAI was doing operator and browser use. And this 3.7 model really has sort of reinvigorated the whole coding agents area. And that was from something that was already pretty invigorated already. So it's interesting to sort of look at that. Yeah, definitely. I think the idea of coding agents are the sort of more uh, enterprise business, sort of more sort of serious agents that are out there and that people are really using. It's really fascinating to sort of see how Anthropic is approaching this. I thought it was really interesting that one. So not only do they release this 3.7 model, which really is kind of built for coding, right? When you look at it, this is their first reasoning model, but it seems to be really specialized around coding. They've also released Claude Code, but even in their sort of GUI interface, like their version of ChatGPT, the actual Claude app, I even in there, they've added in GitHub integration. So you can see that they're going sort of like all full steam ahead for code. And I find it really fascinating to look at how the difference between Anthropic and OpenAI with this kind of thing. It really is like OpenAI is going for the mass market. Anthropic is much more going for the sort of enterprise stuff, and they seem to be doing it in a very bottoms up way of introducing people to to these models, to these agents, and then getting them to actually use them for work things rather than just for sort of chatting to.
Yeah, Sam, I wanted to jump to one of the videos that you did recently when you were jumping in and working with 3.7. You've been looking at this for the last couple of years, but you said things like, "This is insane," right? And you were kind of these exclamation marks as you were going through building these little mini apps literally right there in the interface. What was it that made you exclaim that at that moment in terms of the insanity?
When I was showing that stuff, that was using the Claude's artifacts kind of thing. So this is where you can basically type something in, give it a couple of prompts, and it then can write code and display the output of that code, right? So it can write basically like your own little website, your own little app to do something. Um, and at the time, yeah, it was pretty amazing that it was able to, put a bunch of things together. Since then, I had an even better experience with it. That when OpenAI released their GPT 4.5, which, let's face it, hasn't been the biggest hit. Of course, they didn't want to give out sort of benchmark comparisons to everything. So what I did was just literally take in screenshots from the different providers, throw them in there, and ask Claude, "Hey, write me a little app that shows me the benchmark stats for each of these models." And it was able to put it together in a way that suddenly now we could compare models that lots of providers didn't want us sort of, perhaps showing that, oh, this model is actually better than this model. And that turned out that, DeepSeek was better than GPT 4.5 for a lot of those benchmarks. So I kind of feel like things like that are the real sort of killer thing because you don't need to be a coder to do that. And I think this is sort of where we're going with these kind of tools is that as they get better and as they get more reliable, that it's not so much about the code, it's about just prompting it to get some kind of app or some kind of interactive experience. And I think that's where the 3.7 really is a big sort of step forward.
Sam, one of the things that you've mentioned is Claude's specialization on coding and now coding agents. And it's clear that they see this as the big enterprise play, right? There was some information that was leaked about their revenue projections. I think that they've been sharing with investors that they are hoping that revenue hits $36 billion by 2027, which is not far off of OpenAI's 45 billion. But it's doing so presumably on a bet that they are going to be the agent or the LLM that's being used for these coding agents in the enterprise, right? So they have this whole play and they're clearly gunning for it, focusing on it, and have kind of pole position now being the leading coding LLM. And they've also released studies around the usage of AI and Gen AI. You said at one point it was just 70% of applications are essentially code.
If something is wrong in code, you will spot it very quickly. So it's a different kind of hallucination. Like if it just doesn't work, it doesn't work,
Right.
right?
You'll get a
Where
syntax error. It'll say, hey, we can't do this.
Yes, exactly, right? Whereas, if you're reporting on some facts and you've got it wrong, you don't know that you've got it wrong until someone tells you got it wrong. So I think that's an advantage that, yeah, they've got. Look at, yes, it is massively interesting that you got to think their number one customer is Cursor, this developer tool that helps people code that now is also an agent and it's got agents in it. So it can basically do stuff. And most people on that were using the Claude Sonnet model already, the 3.5 models already. And now it seems everyone's just migrating over to 3.7. So the fact that they've been so big, you've got to think that they're probably Anthropic's number one customer. Or if they're not, they're certainly up there. I'd love to know who is the number one customer if they're not, if it's not them. And we know for a fact that Anthropic has had trouble keeping their servers up because Cursor was so popular. So many people were using it that they've had to try and scale up their infrastructure to be able to do this. So it does seem to me that the Claude 3.7 model really is built around all the things that they've learned from that partnership with Cursor.
Cursor having 40,000 paying users, $100 million in annual recurring revenue, ARR, within 12 months. It's supposedly the fastest, I think, SaaS company to reach that level ever. It's crazy. It went to an agent default mode last month, right? So definitely
Yeah.
Cursor is trying to stay there on the agent side. It's a big part of this conversation. What I found is I will quickly default to Claude's models 3.7. So I had an experiment where I wanted to see if I could pull in through an API from VentureBeat's articles into a database so that we could actually start pulling in these sorts of assets, maybe other assets eventually down the line where our writers could then actually kind of search over this and do better research before they write their articles. And so, was able to get to, some really elementary apps through this. But what I found is that with Sonnet 3.7 directly through the Claude app, it was giving me some really good powers. In other words, it was kinda helping me walk through those steps of building a database. It chose Airtable for me, and it walked me through how to pull in the articles from the VentureBeat API into Airtable using something called make.com for the connections. I was having to do all that myself, right? So it wasn't coding as much as, let's say, Cursor, right? And then finally, Claude Code, which works through the terminal, did something similar to Cursor, where hey, it didn't walk me through all these apps externally. It actually worked through my terminal and used SQLite, which allowed me to have a little database right there in my terminal, like that it could actually search locally. That is by pulling in articles from our RSS feed. So it's completely local, zero costs. simple to maintain. It was reliable. Okay, here I'm going to walk through how I used Anthropic's Claude 3.7. I wanted to figure out a way we could build a basic database to pull in some of our articles and then some other assets where our writers could be a little more sophisticated in terms of the information that they're researching for our articles to be more organized. As you can see, here's my prompt, right? And then it comes back and says, I understand you're looking to create a database to store VentureBeat articles. Let me walk through some options. So the first one was PostgreSQL, kind of a more robustness, gave me the advantages, and then there was Elasticsearch with MongoDB, Airtable as a lightweight solution, and then I kept chatting with it. Right, think through how would we do this together, step by step, and this is how I'm approaching these things now. Is I'm realizing that you need to slow them down. They're extra eager to get started, these coding agents. And so it's the case with Claude 3.7. So I want to actually have it walk step by step through the options so that we can kind of reach a conclusion about the way forward first. And we want to do this together, the most straightforward possible option, least possible steps, minimize the risk of errors. Okay. So it recognizes this, and so it recommends the Airtable implementation. So then it gives me a plan on how to go do this. And so I'm going through this, and I'll say it probably takes me about an hour to go through some of these things. Give it the feeds. I want to give it limit in terms of how much that I'm going to spend, $20, so that it comes up with like this basic plan. Right. So you read the basic plans here, and then a practical guide for implementation. I read it through all relatively quickly. So they've introduced this make.com product, which allows you to make these connections between the API and then iterating over those articles and putting them into Airtable. So that it gives me a series of steps to make me go to Airtable and me to take the steps within Airtable. It's not coding it all by itself. It's basically Claude is just making me actually do a lot of the work, going into the applications and setting them up. And I've used Airtable before a few times, so it wasn't completely foreign to me. But that's something to consider in terms of the amount of work that it took. I had to configure the articles table. So again, it took me about an hour to kind of go through this and set up all these things. Sonnet wanted to use the OAuth process of pulling information from the VentureBeat feed. That didn't work. So I had to switch to a token-based authentication system, which was the second option that Claude finally recommended. That process probably took about an hour because it kept trying to build these different modules with make.com, different processes. So, that was basically the second hour of going through this. So it could suck up time with these trials and errors. Got to be careful, and you got to just make sure you're cutting through and getting some progress. And maybe just saying, hey, we got to simplify this. We can't do everything we wanted to do. We couldn't pull in all of the items from the WordPress articles, like authors, for example. I didn't want to spend hours and hours on this. Here's the make.com interface. This basically shows the connections that the Sonnet coding agent was walking me through. So here's the connectors, right? So here's the HTTP module where I'm pulling in the feed, and it walked me through how to do that. And then it helped me set up the JSON parse, right, where it parses the data from that feed. Airtable can begin to read the elements of that feed. And then it created this iterator that was connected to that, where it can then iterate over the individual articles. And all that would then go into Airtable. And then suddenly, voila, it ended up populating these fields that I was looking for in a much more coherent way, so that Airtable could pull in the right data for these right fields that we'd set up in Airtable. Here's the Airtable interface. And so basically at the beginning, I had to set up these different tabs. There's several of them, right? Here's the title, URL, publication date, excerpt. Again, Sonnet 3.7 is asking me to set these things up, and it's walking me through how to do it. And in categories, authors, these are the ones we ended up giving up on. You'll see that it pulled a sampling of articles in our first test just to make sure. It did get them all correctly. It noted that they were all GainsSpeed articles. They happened to be published at that time. So there you have it. So this is Claude Code, and it works through the terminal. You see the interface here, right? It's chatting with you. So here's my prompt, right? This lighter text. And I said, hey, is there an easier way to do this? I had to do all this manually with Claude 3.7 in the Anthropic app. So I'm asking Claude Code, can you figure out a way to code this so that I don't actually have to do all this myself? It says, I can definitely help you find a much simpler solution. Instead of using multiple platforms, we can create a Python script. And so it boom, right? It's super eager. It goes straight through, propose something right away. Now it graded out because I eventually came back and rejected it because it was way too eager. And so it says, you're absolutely right. And so it's slowing it down, thinking through the challenges, the core functionality first, and then what to do about things like categories, right? And tags. And I said, hey, why don't we start with the simplest version, and go from there. So then boom, it codes something, it then and creates it. But it did run into some bugs, right? So we got a forbidden error from the API. And so they're trying to understand it. And so it's interesting because then it moved to the RSS feed, right? So it's quickly moving to probably a much simpler option because we're sitting here in the terminal, we're doing something automated, more automated than what I was doing with the Anthropic app with Claude 3.7 directly. It's coming up with some other more simple solutions, and it finally comes up with this app, fairly simple, fairly straightforward. It added a bunch of things, made a few changes. And so it got to this point where, hey, I could pull in the top 10 articles, the latest 10 articles from VentureBeat. It gave me the date, gave me the title, and it gave me the URL. And then if I pushed, one of these numbers 1 through 10, I could actually ask for get a summary. Now, it didn't provide the full article text, so I couldn't read the article or search over it like you could do in Airtable. It was much simpler. And so I still think that this interface is much more automated, but it's, as a result, probably going to come up with much simpler solutions, right? More hacky or maybe thinner solutions than the kind of more robust solutions that Claude 3 through Anthropic can take you through if you're ready to go do the work in individual applications yourself.
So I think you highlighted a number of interesting points there. The challenge that people are having as not being a coder is really that they don't know a lot of the terminology, they don't know best practices, they don't know the sort of standard ways of doing things like that. So often in cases like that, actually just having a conversation with Claude in its sort of user interface is a great way for it to sort of work out you actually want, and then you basically ask it, hey, write me a design doc for this, right? Write me the sort of design spec for this. And then you copy paste that into Cursor. And it then has a lot more knowledge about what it is to actually do. It doesn't have to come back to you every step. It can do things like this. So this is the whole sort of thing that people have been talking about vibe coding, of where, that, if you do kind of know what you're doing, it's pretty easy to keep it on track for most things, at least for certainly things like front ends. And the interesting thing is that the Sonnet 3.7 is probably a little bit eager compared to 3.5, where 3.5 would kind of wait for you to tell it to do things. The 3.7 kind of just jumps in there and thinks, well, you're going to tell me to do that later on, so I might as well just try it out now. So there's definitely been some issues around that. I think one of the interesting things that Cursor introduced recently that we haven't talked about is this whole idea of these MCP servers. Uh, and this is a really, fascinating thing that came out of Anthropic. And actually, at the start, it came out of Anthropic as a way of giving their kind of Claude app the ability to connect with search, to connect with the web, and some other things like that. Okay, so one of the things that we're seeing that's getting agents and coding agents specifically to get a lot better is the use of something that Anthropic introduced back in November called the Model Context Protocol. And basically, what this is an open protocol that allows agents, or what they call hosts, to be able to use various different tools. So if we look at the architecture for this, you could imagine that your host is basically a coding agent like Cursor, like Windsurf, like Claude Code. And it can have access to various tools, which might be things like a specific database that's unique to your organization. It might be the ability to go and scrape a web page. In fact, if we look at what's available, originally, there were a number of reference servers from Anthropic when they released it. And the only host at the start was the actual Claude app itself. But now we can see we've got a whole bunch of third-party MCP servers that have been made by people, as well as tens, if not hundreds, of these community servers where people have built something to be able to do a specific, unique thing in the way that an agent would use a tool. And you can see sometimes that's going to be just allowing the agent to use another model like DeepSeek R1 or to use something like 11 Labs to generate voice out. Now, for coding, you'll be able to see that there are many of these for things like scraping, for things like accessing the terminal, accessing different languages, accessing Hugging Face, etc. So these are one of the key things that is propelling the whole coding agent movement that we're seeing take off right now. But the cool thing was that they deliberately chose to publish as an open protocol. And just like, we've got HTML, like we've got, the email protocols and stuff like that. By sort of launching this as an open protocol, they're sort of saying, hey, everyone, have at it, right? You can develop whatever you want that fits this protocol. We're going to support this protocol. We encourage other people to support it as well. Well, it turns out people, that was sort of like in November last year. Turns out that people have jumped in on this. And now, like Cursor is one of the perfect examples. So this is giving people access to sort of build tools for these coding agents. And that tool might be like looking up something in a database, scraping some data, getting something from, somewhere else, having some way of checking something. All of these things are really kind of cool and sort of advancing this whole coding agents paradigm as well.
What does that mean for the enterprise, Sam, though, right? So if we're talking about enterprise grades solutions, is this, the MCP and some of the assets being built around it, allowing enterprise maybe to get comfortable with this in a quicker way?
Before this, everyone was trying to do it in their own way. Like you had LangChain tools, you had Llama index tools, you had all these different ways of people were trying to build their own sort of tool integrations or API integrations. Now with the MCP servers, companies can basically go, well, we want to build this one for internally, but we can go and have a look at what Anthropic built. We can have a look at what people have open sourced all over the place, and we can use the lessons from that to basically build our own. Even if they never share it back, like even if it's for just an internal tool or something, the fact that they're conforming to this protocol is just making things much easier and more sort of standardized. So you've got to think now that like as we see, some of the new models like perhaps Llama 4 come out, even things like DeepSeek and stuff like that, people are starting to now think about like, okay, well, we can just support this protocol because we know it's fully open. And if we're basically patching it up to that, we can then basically use, hundreds of tools that people are making already out there. So I think this is a really interesting, sort of move that Anthropic made and put out there. And it has probably taken sort of 2, 3 months to really take off, but it does look like it's getting a lot of momentum now. I think we've got Cursor supporting it, we've got Windsurf supporting it, we've got other, coding agents and stuff supporting it. So this is something that's definitely a step in the right direction, I feel.
Yeah, it looks really powerful. I want to go and look at the rest of the market. I think but before we do that, I think the other point, just before we finish up on Anthropic, is one of the things they did is they allowed a way for you to not only build these mini apps, but to publish them, right? And share them,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's another component where, hey, this ability to have people within the enterprise, whether it's a developer or a non-coder, such as myself, build these things, share them so that then this inspiration can happen within the enterprise. And then if you want an enterprise grade solution, then of course your developers can actually build that. And it's also available, these tools and LLMs on AWS and Google Cloud, for example, everything that Anthropic is doing. But let's go look at the rest of the market, right? So we've touched on Cursor, right? Copilot, obviously, from Microsoft, 1.3 million paid users, right? So there's an agent involved there. Google's Code Assist, right? They made that free just recently. I think it was about 10 days ago or so. They're not necessarily making money on it, but I think then there'll be an enterprise grade solution that, of course, they'll probably want to upsell on. But again, I think Google, uh, is wanting to have a horse in every race. And I think we've touched on how Anthropic is laser focused and has the edge right now, right? And so even though you have Gemini 2.0 and a lot of credibility there. Let's just say we move to Replit, Sam, right? Where you have a Google native developer, where you can do things where you're not necessarily reliant on-prem. I think that's another question. Hey, will the enterprise trust these cloud IDEs, for serious software engineering, right? Because they want these security and controls.
So I do think things are going to break down, quite differently. Yeah, like it seems to me that the moment Cursor and Windsurf and those kind of IDEs are sort of the beloved ones from sort of just general devs out there. I don't know if they're being used inside big organizations. So you got to think that Google and Microsoft and AWS, like the big sort of tech companies, they're definitely going for the corporate adoption, and they will get it, I think, too, because it makes sense that, okay, if you've already got a contract with Google, you're already using them for GCP, and then you can basically we can basically let your coders use that code assist and then have it hooked up to your private code databases, right? So that's the key thing, is that companies don't want their own code being leaked out to other people. They want to basically have their own coders be able to access it and use it and reuse it and improve it, etc. But they want to keep that in a closed environment. And I think this is where things like GCP will do well, right? That they will basically get a lot of customers who are corporates who do want to have a specialized version of Code Assist that's just for their company, that's using the languages that they're using, that's sort of maybe a little bit fine-tuned for their code base, that kind of thing. I think we're going to see that a lot.
So doesn't it feel like in the enterprise, there are three main players, where you have, OpenAI, obviously, and then Microsoft, with the partnership with Microsoft, there's Copilot, where they're driving that as a kind of set of coding agents. Then you have Anthropic, right? So as you mentioned, AWS being the other big cloud that enterprise companies are using, right? But it looks like they're reliant on Anthropic through these big investments from AWS into Anthropic. So they have a partnership, right? So you have Azure, you have AWS, right, through Anthropic, and then you have Google, right? I mean, those are the big three players for the enterprise. And so, like we've seen in the past, it feels like this revolution, coding agents in the enterprise will be those big three players, right?
Matt, I heard this really interesting story this week about a big company I was talking to. I'm not going to name them, but they told me that, they've got quite a lot of licenses of Copilot, but the problem is 80% of those licenses are not being used. So their challenge is, how do we invigorate our people to actually start using this stuff that we're paying for, right?
Right.
So you got to think that if that if that happens, and then they start seeing, well, people actually like using Anthropic, or people actually like using Cursor, or whatever the tool is, we've talked about it before. The whole concept of sort of like the bring your own device could end up being the sort of, hey, bring your own AI tool, or at least pick from one of these five that we're going to support. Now, there are a lot of companies out there that are doing things like having a proxy internally, so that all the data has to go through the proxy and then can go to different models, outside, but only ones that are vetted. And then they can also stop any sort of leakage of, intellectual property, that kind of thing, from going out. So I think we'll see things like that more, combined perhaps with some more choices of tools going forward.
Absolutely. That is the power that you're seeing with Anthropic's Claude, with Cursor, right? Folks like myself and others are going to be pulled into this, using these things, sharing what they've done, and then others within the organization really advocating for it. And so you've seen that in past revolutions as well. As you mentioned, the iPhone. iPhone was originally shut out. Remember, it wasn't necessarily enterprise grade, for a lot of companies that weren't on, say, the Apple platform. What Apple platform, right? It was a consumer company. But then suddenly there was a capitulation as so many employees brought these iPhones into the workplace. And then there was an accommodation of that. But it took some time. And I think we're seeing, these examples of enterprise companies that have tried to shut out this so-called, these rogue LLMs, right? There was all this fear around what could happen, right, if developers were working on these things, right? Would they be runaway agents doing things on the side? And we talked with executives at places like Honeywell that have said, hey, they've shut down the rogue use of these sorts of tools, any use of OpenAI or other things that are not endorsed by their IT department. I think that has to change. Let's move on to the enterprise adoption roadmap is kind of our final kind of a close here, Sam, right? In terms of what's the right strategy. And I think we've touched on it. You have to be, piloting and experimenting with these tools. You kind of have to have, as you say, this proxy environment where you allow this experimentation to happen because it's too powerful to ignore, right?
Yeah, I think totally it's the balance between security, uh, and sort of experimentation at the moment, right? That clearly on the developer side, people are starting to build real world apps with this stuff, really make stuff happen. So in on those, cases, yes, maybe you can dictate that, okay, uh, you're going to basically go for the OpenAI models or the Anthropic models or the Gemini models, those kind of things. But it does seem that for the more sort of general use applications, you kind of want to be able to allow your people to experiment in some way. I think that the Claude consumer app, or the sort of Claude front end app, I would call it, I I think that's gonna really change a lot of things, because I think once people, start building little apps with that, and like you said, they can share them, if you suddenly get someone in a team of 20 people or something that just gets really good at this and builds some cool apps that they share around that team, everyone's going to start using it. Right. And that's good. Then the challenge is going to be, okay, how do you restrict it so that you are getting that security, but you are allowing people to try new things out.
Sam, so there's a revolution happening here, clearly, right? This an insane moment, as you call it. There's these independent folks, even myself, who are getting involved. We're creating these apps. However, a lot of the apps that I'm creating are pretty flimsy, right? There's a lot of trial and error. I'm running into bugs. I think when you see these vibe coding moment, a lot of people are exclaiming, "Hey, I built this cool app." When you look at it closely, it's sometimes pretty modest in terms of its abilities. But Sam, you have been working on agents and probably publicly kind of experimenting with these things more than just about anyone. At Red Dragon, you have clients. What are the real use cases right now in 2025 for these coding agents within the enterprise, right? And then maybe what will they be in a year from now, roughly? Can you paint that picture?
So I think at the moment that the current sort of in relation to coding, they're very heavily guided by a developer, right? It's not just like, hey, go and build me an app, and then and it just miraculously happens. There's definitely this element of sort of thinking it through, uh, you know, giving the actual agent some guidance, and then checking on it when it doesn't work and working out why it doesn't work. I think that's where we're at the moment. I started using Cursor about a year ago, right? I thought I would try it out. And it was really only when the 3.5 Sonnet model came out that I really started thinking, oh yeah, this is kind of cool, right? Before that, I had tried GitHub, Copilot. I tried a bunch of things, and generally, I kind of felt like, okay, these things are nice for writing small bits of code here and there, but not for sort of planning out a full app. I now think they're good enough to plan out a full app, right? I think that there's a whole bunch of strategy around how you do that.
Right.
I and that's quite in depth. We haven't even talked about things like Cursor has what they call Cursor rules, where you tell it your stack, you tell it like what it should and shouldn't do, and all these sorts of things. All those things have come around sort of recently and made things a lot better.
Right.
I But you've got to think a year out from now, a lot of that is not going to be necessary, because just as we're creating apps with these models now, we're also basically teaching these companies how to make these models better, to be able to get better at making these apps.
And you have something called chaos coding now, right, Sam? Where you could just
Yes.
say, "Hey, just build me
Yep.
something and let's go," right? And you can imagine, if you can afford like 100 of these agents because it's all automated, right? And you can afford to have like 10, 15 of these things saying, "Okay, here's my stack, here's my goal," right? Here's a few areas that I've been thinking through, or these possible ways to develop things. Go chaos code for the next 365 days. Come back occasionally and let us know what you've come up with. I mean, this is gonna be really interesting.
It is definitely gonna be really interesting. I think in the whole chaos coding thing or the YOLO coding thing, kind of thing of where you just go for it, and you're not even sort of really checking it, you're just telling it, "Hey, check yourself. Okay, what would you do next? What would you do next?" Kind of thing. I that is really interesting as these models get better and as they combine with other sorts of information. So you could imagine that, as these things a year from now, 2 years, 5 years from now, as these things are baked into people's companies and they know what your sales figures are, they know what products people like, they know how much time people spend on a website. They are then able to use all that data to optimize as they're coding new products. And that's eventually where we get to. The question is just how fast do we get there?
Yeah, okay, so to summarize the answer to my original question about what the use cases are, there's no real distinct use case per se. This is kind of pervasive across the c the coding stack, right? So it involves every app that the enterprise is using, right? Every component of it can actually be assisted by code is essentially what you're saying. So really powerful stuff. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more insights into the latest in AI for enterprise decision makers. For deeper analysis and updates, visit VentureBeat.com and sign up for our newsletters.